Hello, Year 10. I hope you're well. Welcome to English. It is Monday, the 18th of January, 2021. And today we're going to be moving on to look at an introduction to GCSE poetry. We are leaving A Christmas Carol behind now. We have finished with that, and we are moving on to look at your GCSE anthology poetry. All right, so that's your date and title on the board there. If you want to pause the video a moment and get those written down, please feel free to do so. But otherwise I shall carry on. So today's objectives, all right, we're going to aim to understand what you will cover in this series of lessons. We're going to aim to understand what knowledge you will need about each poem in order to succeed in this unit. And we're going to aim to identify and discuss some key subject terminology, all right? Those are the three things we are aiming to do today. So, as an introduction to your GCSE poetry, the poetry forms part of your English literature exam, the second paper, and it's the middle section, section B of that paper. It's one of three sections within that English literature exam. We are going to be focusing on the power and conflict poetry. And within the exam, you will be asked to compare two poems from the anthology, and there are 15 poems in total that we will be looking at. Okay, so it's all power and conflict poetry. There are 15 poems, and when it does come to the exam, you would be asked to compare two of those 15 poems within the question. And it comes from the Poems Past and Present anthology, Power and Conflict specifically. So within this, we've already said we've got 15 poems, and we've got poems from a really large range of time, sort of moving from William Blake in the late 18th, early 19th century, right, the Romantic era, moving through to the 20th century. We've got a lot of poems to do with sort of war and conflict, moving through to more modern day poetry, so some things from the 21st century. So a real range there, but all of them will come back to link to both power and conflict, along with many, many other themes. If we were in school at present, you would be given a book that looks a little bit like this, okay? And this would be your poetry anthology. This is what you would use to make notes, etc., etc. It looks a little bit like this inside, minus all the colourful notes. All right, those notes are the sorts of things that we would add in class. In lesson, okay, this is what the aim would be. We'd work through each poem in the anthology, and we would aim to make all these notes and learn certain things about each poem. So that in the end, your anthology might look a little bit like this. Now, since we can't get these to you while you're remote learning, I have attached a copy of the poems you're going to need for now on to show my homework in a document. That all 7 poems are there in one document because we're just looking at 7 to begin with. I'll talk more about that in a moment. If you have the facility to, I would highly recommend printing those off and using them to make your notes when we start going through the poems individually later in the week. If you can't print, but if you perhaps have a way of opening the document on screen and making notes alongside it, that might work. But I think it'd be really handy if you had some way of recording notes about each poem on a piece of paper or on a document on your computer next to the poem itself. That would prove really, really useful. So, as I mentioned a moment ago, we are only going to look at 7 poems to begin with. We're going to focus on all of the poems that are to do with war. Okay, and we're going to aim to spend about 2 lessons per poem. All right, and this is the order that we're going to do them. We're going to start with Bayonet Charge. That will be your lesson for tomorrow and Wednesday. Move on to Charge the Light Brigade, Exposure, Kamikaze, Poppies, Remains, and War Photographer. That will take us up until February half term. Okay, those are the first 7 poems that we are going to look at over the next 4 weeks. And like I said, that document is attached on Show My Homework with all of the poems in it. Should you be able to utilise it to help make your notes, okay? So what are we going to be looking for in the poems? With each poem, there are 3 things we need to consider. We need to consider firstly the form of the poem, and this is the style in which the poem is written. All right, is it a sonnet? Is it a dramatic monologue? How does the rhyme scheme contribute to what the form of the poem might be? All right, there are certain pro formas that poets can follow, all right, certain structures and styles of poetry that poets can follow when writing their poems, and sometimes this links to sort of the message or the idea of the poem. Sometimes it's just a reflection of the time in which it was written, but essentially we're considering the poem as a whole, right? Considering the features of the poem in its entirety. Okay, what is the form of it? How does this link to its main messages, themes, and ideas? As I said, some poets choose to adopt a particular form, but others do not, and often this can link to what it is the poem is about, and this is something we'll be looking for. The next thing we'll consider is the structure of the poem. The structure is the organisation of the poem on the page. How many stanzas does it have? What are the line lengths? Who's the narrator? What's the rhythm? Or looking at certain techniques such as enjambment or lists or repetition or caesura. All right, where do these things feature? If they do feature, and once again, how does this all link to what the poem is about? With structure, we're not looking at the words themselves as much as how they appear on the page, how they are organised, okay? When it comes to looking at the words themselves, that's when we then move on to language, okay? And language refers to the individual words or phrases in a poem and their overall effect on the poem. We're zooming in on the words that the poet is using. And we consider the ways in which the poet uses language in a particular way to have an effect, all right? So we're looking for poetic devices such as metaphors, similes, personification, pathetic fallacy, and more, okay? Well, we're looking for those things in there and then seeing, once again, how that links to what the poem is about, what message the poet is trying to convey, all right, and what topics and themes the poem is dealing with. Now, I am aware that I'm going to be giving you a lot of information as part of this video lesson this Monday, so I wanted to include just some regular pit stops for you to be allowed to pause for a moment and think back to everything we've covered to ensure that you're picking out the information that I need you to. So we're going to do this check for understanding pit stop here, and your task is going to be to use the information covered in the video so far to answer these questions. Number one, what type of poetry will you be studying? Power and finish that off. Number two, how many poems are in the anthology in total? How many poems will you study in total? Number three, which of the poems will we focus on first? All right, and I'm looking for a group of poems here, okay? And number four, what three things are we looking for in the poem? So pause the video here, rewind it if you need to gain some of these answers, but I want you to answer all four questions and then play the video again where we'll go through the answers. Excellent. Hopefully by now you've managed to have a go at all four of those questions. I will now move on to go through the answers. Please, mark the answers you've done. If you've got them right, well done. If you need to correct any, please do so. So number one, what type of poetry will you be studying? It's power and conflict poetry, all right? All of the poems that we will look at link to these two ideas of power and conflict in some way. Number two, how many poems are in the anthology in total? 15 poems in total we'll be studying. Number three, which of the poems will we focus on first? We're focusing on the war poems first of all. All right, starting with Bayonet Charge tomorrow. And number four, what three things are we looking for in the poems? We're looking at form, structure, and language. Okay, those are the three things that we will look for when approaching each poem. And I'm now going to go into each of those in a bit more detail and how we might consider each of those things when we look at the poems. But first of all, I just wanted to make a note about what we need to consider when we are thinking critically about these poems, when we're thinking about any text in general, really. But this is a process that we will use when looking at each of the poems. We will be considering what the poet does. What is the poet saying? What are they doing within their poem? What message are they trying to convey? We then need to consider how is the poet doing it. All right, and then moving on to the why might the poet have chosen to do something in a particular way. Okay, so what's the poet doing, how are they doing it, and why are they doing it? Okay, these poems generally are trying to convey a message in some form, and it's our job to kind of work out what that message is, how we know it, and why the poet may have wanted to do it. Okay, so we know that we're looking at form, structure, and language when it comes to each of these poems, but when it comes to considering what that means in more detail, I've come up with some questions for us to consider with for each section. So we know that form is the style in which the poem is written, and some questions for us to consider when looking at the form of a poem include: does the poem have a particular form? How does this form link to the ideas or message of the poem? If the poem does not have a particular form, why might this be significant? Sometimes a poem may lack a structure or a particular form, and this itself might be really interesting to look at. And overall, always considering, why has the poet done this? Why has the poet chosen to do this? Is it outside influences, or is it something perhaps linked to the message of the poem itself? Similarly, for structure, the organisation of the poem on the page, some questions for us to consider when looking at the structure of a poem. Does the way the poem appears on the page link to its meaning? How might the number of stanzas or the stanza length or length of lines be important? Is there a rhyme scheme? If there is the rhyme scheme regular or varied? How does all of this information link back to the poem? And then what is the rhythm or the metre of the poem? And once again, always considering why. Why has the poet done this? Why has the poet chosen to present the poem in this particular way? And then moving on to language as well. We know language refers to the individual words or phrases in a poem and their overall effect on the poem. And some questions to consider when looking at language. When you read the poem, what words or phrases stand out? Why do they stand out? How do the words used link to the overall idea of the poem? Can we identify any poetic devices? Those are the things such as metaphors, similes, personification, pathetic fallacy. There will be more as well that we'll look at when we need to. And how do these devices link to the meaning of the poem? Once again, always considering why. Why has the poet done this? Okay. Why have they chosen to use these words, present them in that way, or use that poetic device? How does this all link to what the poem is about? So, another pit stop task here, okay? Once again, we're just going to reflect on what the information that's just been covered. So your task here is to answer the following questions in full sentences. And I've given you some sentence starters to help you out here. But question 1, what is form? Question 2, what is structure? And question 3, what is language? All right, and I want you to finish off the sentences using the starters that I've given you there. So pause the video here, rewind it a little bit if you need to check some things to help you with these answers. All right, but give those questions a go and play the video again when you're ready to go through the answers. Excellent. Hopefully by now you've managed to have a go at all of those questions. I am now going to go through the answers, okay? So number 1, what is form? Form is the style in which the poem is written when you're looking at the poem as a whole. Question 2, what is structure? Structure is the organisation of the poem on the page, okay? We're starting to look at things in a bit more detail, a bit more line by line, seeing what is significant about the way the words are laid out. And then number 3, what is language? Language refers to the individual words or phrases in a poem and their overall effect. We're zooming in on the words that are being used and considering why they're there, why the poet might have decided to use them and what effect they have. So moving on to our last task for today, I wanted to introduce to you some structure related subject terminology. All of these words on the screen are words that will feature as we move through all of the poems. So I thought it would be really good to introduce you to some of them now, okay, so you can kind of get used to them. So on the board, I've included 7 different terms and their definitions. Your next task is going to be to create your own table to include these terms and definitions. What I would suggest you do, though, is that you perhaps use one side of A4 and make a large subject terminology table that allows for more than 7 terms to be included. As we move through the lessons, we will introduce more and more subject terminology to you. So it'd be really handy if you could all have this kind of glossary table that does slowly begin to include all of these terms and definitions that we do include. So your task, grab a piece of paper, draw a table and include term and definition as your headings, and then begin to copy these into it. Okay, so we've got structure, which we know is the organisation of the poem on the page. Stanza, a group of lines in a poem. The rhythm or metre, the measured flow of words and phrases in poetry determined by the number and position of stressed and unstressed syllables. Rhyme, words with endings that sound similar to each other. Repetition, when a word or phrase is used more than once. Enjambment, when one line of poetry runs into the next without any punctuation. And caesura, a pause that breaks the rhythm or pace in a line of poetry, which can be created by any piece of punctuation. So you can pause the video here or copy this table down, but as I have said, I would recommend making the table much bigger, okay? Include more than 7 lines because you're going to be adding in more and more subject terminology as we move through the lessons. If you manage to get that done, you've still got some time left in your hour that you're dedicating to English. One thing I would suggest you do is actually consider turning the information on the key terminology table on the previous slide into some self-quizzing questions. I know you will have all come across self-quizzing questions at some point in English so far. It's a really, really, really useful revision technique, okay? And I think it might prove beneficial at this time to slowly be building these questions as you move through the lessons. So as I said, if you've still got some time left in your hour that you're dedicating to English today, I want you to take the information in this table and turn them into self-quizzing questions. How might you do this? As an example, my question could be, what is a stanza? My answer would be a group of lines in a poem. So it's up to you where you write these self-quizzing questions on a piece of paper. You might want to make your own flashcards. I would just suggest keeping the answer far away from the question, okay? Because if you can see the answer when you're reading the question, then you're not really testing yourself on what you do and do not know. But complete this task if you have some time left over. Otherwise, that is the end of today's lesson. So hopefully by all that information that you've been given, you've gained an understanding and helped to meet these objectives. All right, hopefully you now understand what you will cover in this series of lessons. We know that we are going to be going through the first part of the poems within the anthology. To understand what knowledge you need about each poem to succeed in this unit, we know we're going to be looking at the form, structure and language used within each poem. And of course, we've looked at some key subject terminology, where your task was to copy down that table with all those key terms in it, leaving some space for more for later on, and if you've had time, moving on to turn those into self-quizzing questions. Any questions about anything that we've covered in this video, please do get in touch with your English teacher. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day, and the next video will be up tomorrow.